If you're listening to the radio and you're listening for a particular news reporter and you hear something that is related to the pledge drive, but then you hear Homer Simpson or you hear Tony Soprano, it just shocks you for a second, and then people start to listen a little bit more. And ad concepts, ad specs, or advertisements that don't say a lot but are really sensory. And I like to run and I like to watch a lot of running content. And there's some really cool running ads like that don't say a lot of stuff, but that show you a lot. And I think that concept of showing and not telling is very important. When we see that brands are responding to that too, we tend to kind of build a bit more trust, or we tend to kind of build a bit more resonance with what they're doing. So again, it's just being a human and being really conscious of what's happening in real time, and knowing that people are going to have different types of changes, and being able to pivot and respond to that in real time and learn from those moments will make you an effective advertiser.
Welcome back to the show, Rob. Please introduce yourself for those who maybe didn't catch our last episode, and please explain a little bit about your role in advertising in the past couple of years.
Cool. Yeah. So that's right. I'm back for more. My name is Rob Martinez. I am the creative producer for UT San Antonio's video production group. And what I do currently is I produce lots of original content that really stems from long form interviews, but then that cuts down to kind of a bit more bite-sized interviews that become advertisements. They become ads on Facebook and meta platforms and Instagram and such. And so what I've done in the past is I worked for a news and media company, NPR affiliate here in Texas, in San Antonio. And what I did with them a number of years back is we produced about a dozen podcasts in about 2 years span. And as that was going on, I was a part of a group from Pointer Institutes, which is a news and media nonprofit, really a group that was all about digital transformation for NPR affiliates specifically, and news and print publications. And so what we were talking about with them was, how do we create really the funnel mindset for how we operate as a news and media organization, but also most importantly as a news and media organization that's going through lots of different audience changes and reaching lots of different types of audiences. That experience, coupled with my real time working with the producers to put out these podcasts and trying to get some metrics about how that was being consumed, really went hand in hand and really gave me a fundamental understanding of why we should consider audiences when we produce content and when we're publishing content out.
And you mentioned the funnel. For those of our audience who have not heard of the funnel, can you explain how that relates to these influence industries?
Sure. I mean, very broadly, the funnel is a bit of a mindset. And if you will, you have an opportunity here to connect a very broad audience, and introduce them to either your product or your organization. In this case, I'm going to speak to how we were thinking about this from a public radio standpoint. So, very broadly, people know the NPR brand and people know Tiny Desk, but people don't know that Texas Public Radio is really just its own entity, and we just license content from NPR. So that's a bit of a top of the funnel, getting to reach the brand at a broad standpoint, but then teaching them about, like, okay, well, here's what we are as a nonprofit, as a news entity based in San Antonio, producing original content. So then we reach people and show them that we have original content. They get to know what that is and they get familiar with it. And then they go a little bit deeper in the funnel. Maybe they get a bit more compelled to learn how they can support and what that really means as an organization for an organization rather that is community funded, like 100% most of the time, especially now, 100% community funded. And then as you go deeper into that, you really have an opportunity to get people who are listeners to really become a retention member, somebody who is supporting monthly and really just coming back to a lot of the events and listening regularly. And so really it's taking a person from the very, very broad and bringing them down to a moment of an opportunity where you're creating loyalty, like I said, for your brand, for your product, or for your organization.
Excellent. And I know that in that process, you're thinking about a lot of different dimensions. Can you walk us through some of the kind of market research that you did in that project specifically with NPR and TPR?
Well, to be very candid, we were pushing out a lot of content and didn't have a lot of time for market research. And even the content, or rather the data that we did have on the other end of how the media was consumed, we really didn't have much. And so we were really relying on what our members were telling us. And so I think that's why understanding how somebody can become a loyal member, like I said, of the brand, or a loyal supporter of the brand, or a loyal member of the organization, getting to know how they got through the funnel and doing audience surveys are so important, because those are the real time types of data points that you can capture.
Can you connect the marketing research insights that you got from your members to the actual creative choices that you ended up taking whenever you were trying to develop your messaging?
Yeah, I mean, another thing that I should mention that happened during a lot of this was a revamp of our app, which really wasn't being used as much as we wanted. And so the app for Texas Public Radio offers the same experience as you would, if you were listening on the radio, if you were listening on the website, but it's a bit more on demand. And so what we learned was that we had an opportunity to understand how people were actually consuming us as a media organization, as our news. And we found that people were starting to grow and using the app during the pandemic. And so that was some real time data that we were able to just kind of learn how to really market on the app. And it was a third party app that we really had to, you know, minimal changes, but then later on we're able to make a bit more as they grew their capabilities. Seeing how people were consuming our content, rather, I should say, really allowed us to make kind of pivot. And I think, another big point to consider and really talk about was that a lot more folks were finding us through social media. And whenever we produced a new podcast, what I thought was very important was like, what was going to support the episode, what was going to support the launch of the podcast on social media? How was that going to reach the audience? What was that experience going to be like? And so I worked very closely with the producers and some of the editors of the podcast to work on creating some sort of digestible content that we could use as A and B testing ads to see like what folks were responding to and why, perhaps.
Tell us about how this social media rollout worked. What were some of the challenges? What were some of the wins?
The social media wins, I should mention, people that were consuming a lot of media on stories as opposed to interacting with posts. And so one win that I do remember is, this was a time when we were really all indoors on our phones all the time and just consuming media that way. And so reaching folks where they are was a big kind of mindset that I remember was important on how we operated. It's like, we've got to meet our audience where they are. If they're consuming more of our content just on stories as they're scrolling through, let's create some compelling ways to reach our audience, whether it be about the news stories or about the podcast, just to kind of keep them coming. And then utilizing a lot of like click for more. I mean, this was almost 6 years ago, Ryan. I mean, a lot has changed on how people are doing content, but that really was the kind of precipice of like understanding why people were consuming stories back then more so than interacting with posts. And that was because of the algorithm was pushing more content out that way.
And just to put influence campaigns in context, we were on our phones more. We were on Netflix more. We were retreating into our homes far more. So that daily commute where they would have experienced TPR and NPR was disrupted. And people were looking for maybe some normalcy by looking for their old friend TPR in the socials and maybe on websites and in other areas than in the car where they usually might have consumed it.
Yeah, I like I said, I'm no longer with TPR. I'm full-time with UT San Antonio now, but I left TPR at a moment where it was several years after the pandemic and several years after looking at, a few years of data on the Google Analytics side and really seeing that sharp spike and trying to understand and recreate those moments, but knowing that like it really was such an outlier. And then when you look at the Nielsen data, as you mentioned, it's such an inverse because you're right, people weren't driving and they weren't listening on the radio. And so really knowing that was a moment in time where media can't ever really make that happen again, but learning from the insights, like I said, where we had a chance to understand that there was an audience niche audiences that we were building and trying to build content for them specifically because those smaller moments and those smaller points of data gave us a bit more sustainable data sometimes on who our audience was really, because at that moment people were finding TPR all over the world during the pandemic for a variety of different reasons, but Texas particularly was a topic of search.
So this audience research is great for marketing, for advertising, for public relations. What are some other key takeaways from your time at TPR that you now bring into your job at UT San Antonio? What are some of those influence strategies that you learned might have worked for that job that might also work for this one?
Well, as I mentioned, media was really changing and still is. And what I left TPR and still kind of contribute because I sit on a board for them now, but it does give a bit of insight on like the stuff that I was trying to develop and get people to understand is like short form content really is king. And you can tell that now, even 6 years later, you can tell that people consume more short form content. And I think what we're trying to do here at UT San Antonio is understand how people even now are consuming media and try to just respond to that. And so that shifted in our personal sort of MO and how we operate as a group.
The way that you do short form to reach audiences here at UT San Antonio, can you talk about some of the more specific strategies you're using that maybe you might have learned at TPR or you might have just invented as a result of having experiences here that shaped how to shape messages?
But at the very fundamental concept, I mean, we think about composition of framing. That really is important. A lot of people are using phones more, and a lot of people are really wanting to create a space and a really sort of experience when you're watching a video that takes you into where they are. So it feels a bit more authentic. So that's something that we've on the pre-production side as we're planning for B-roll and as we're planning to tell the story of an individual, thinking about the kind of visual cues or the kind of visual really storyboarding of their story is so important for the audience.
I couldn't agree more. Can you walk us through your storyboarding strategies as you're trying to create these messages that are going to have an impact?
One thing that I think is really cool is either ad concepts, ad specs, or advertisements that don't say a lot, but are really sensory. And I like to run and I like to watch a lot of running content. And there's some really cool running ads like that don't say a lot of stuff that show you a lot. And I think that concept of showing and not telling is very important when you're trying to reach like a broad audience, because you're trying to like grab somebody's attention really quickly. And sometimes the silence like is so important. I think that's what I learned at Texas Public Radio, is being able to capture from a sensory perspective, like the whole story, and you grab a lot of room tone and you grab a lot of of natural audio because that brings the audience in. And so when I'm storyboarding, I think about, and I'm working with my team, I really think about how can we tell the story from a whole different type of perspective. And there's a video that I found on YouTube that I took a screenshot of because it's like a quadrant of like 9 different scenes, and they tell the story from like a whole bunch of different types of perspective. It's just somebody walking through like a park, and there's just like a bunch of different angles. And for me, obviously it's a POV, it's a wide shot, it's a close up, it's the shot of the feet, like a tracking shot. And there's just like a variety of different ways to tell a story from a visual perspective without saying a lot. And I think that's something that when we're developing B-roll, we try to be a bit more mindful of.
I know our students will struggle sometimes with telling a story and having a clear direction and a strong point of view in their storyboarding. You just mentioned the different kinds of shots that you might want to set up when creating an advertisement or telling a story online. And do you have any mental shortcuts or anchors in your mind for how to do that more efficiently? Because I can imagine it being so intimidating, especially for a new maker, to make something with all of the colors of the rainbow, right? You have all these options. You have 9 different shots, as you said, available to you. How do you know which one to choose? How do you know when to go medium? How do you know when to go long shot? How do you know to go point of view? How do you know to zoom in on those shoes? What is driving you to make those choices in those moments of shooting?
I mean, it certainly is trusting a lot of your gut about like what is important to the story. But if you really need like just a foundation, obviously the 2 shot of it, you have it's a subject, or if you don't, it's the person, it's a subject, it's a shot of the person, and then if it's their perspective looking out or looking at another subject, that's the foundation. But then you think ultimately about like when you're editing too. And this is, we talked yesterday, or we talked last time about trying to think of the final product in real time. Nowadays, when you're watching something, you'll notice, and you want to be mindful of this as you watch things, especially advertisements, it's very fast and very quick cuts. And so you want to have enough different types of cuts, or you want to cut back and forth between 1 to 2, or mostly really 3, ideally 3 different shots, and do them quickly, but not jarringly, not in a way that's going to throw anybody off, but usually in a nice kind of rhythm. And having those more than 3 shots really helps. But knowing that people are wanting to see a third kind of perspective, right? That third person shot to really kind of set the scene is important as well. And so really thinking about those 3 shots are crucial, but then adding more to the element, if you can develop the scene, or if you can get to the location beforehand to really find some interesting and unique perspectives, that also helps.
That's great advice. And that goes back to the planning process, the storyboarding process, the scout location process. For marketing, this is just as important, because you're trying to communicate an aesthetic, trying to communicate maybe a set of values, our product benefits, our organizational benefits, our values that you want that target audience to buy into. What are some of the things that you've learned in creating advertising specifically, and how might that differ from short form content, digital storytelling?
What I learned, and this was kind of on the tail end of my time really building advertisements from the ground up, because where I'm at right now in my profession is I'm really just worried about the creative. And obviously that is its own job, and advertising is its own job, right? But they're very closely aligned, and they work together to support each other. What I learned when I was building advertisements, and this was through Meta platforms specifically, is that whenever you're using those kind of platforms, a lot of the times they want to keep you in those platforms, and they don't want you to leave those platforms. Sometimes there's, and you'll notice if you're scrolling through Facebook, or if you're scrolling through Instagram, that there are specific ads designed that will show you a lot of different types of content about one particular thing. And so what I learned on my way out of that particular job, as I was building advertisements through Texas Public Radio using those platforms, is that you can utilize video and a lot of different variety of types of media to help build what the experience is like for that audience. And when you do that, you really think about how your product, how your brand is being received. And when you're in that kind of mindset, you really, I think, a bit more attuned to problem solving, or a bit more mindful about like why your content is being consumed in a particular way. And you just are able to pivot more. So I think just being able to flip back and forth about like why this content could be a bit more impactful or effective is relevant and a natural skill to have if you're producing content.
And for calls to action, for example, these platforms don't want you to click out of their platform like you just discussed. They don't want you to go to the website that you did as a call of action. They want to keep you there. So it seems to me that you have quite a challenge there in designing the ad for a call to action. What are some techniques that you've used, and what have you seen successful on the back end of those platforms that give you that rich advertising performance data?
I'm sure a lot has changed since and a lot more is capable and available now, especially with the rise of AI. But what I will say, as folks who are creating forward-facing content, whatever it is, right? If it's an advertisement, if it's a post or whatever, is to be more mindful of accessibility. And I think as of right now, that UT San Antonio right now is at the forefront of trying to establish and really adhere to the policies that will make people reach our content a bit broader, because it is more accessible. And so that is one piece of advice that I will for sure let people to know, to be encouraged to follow and to do. But then also, like, I will say, so like, if you are building content for one particular type of industry or one particular type of brand or product or even a mission, consider what is being done outside of that box. Like, find inspiration outside of what you're designing for, because a lot of the times that could help you.
That kind of inspiration comes from other ads, comes from other creators, comes from all over the place. And whenever I'm watching ads, I'm often looking for, okay, what is the main message that they're trying to communicate to the target audience, but there's a whole lot that I'm not able to see. The market research, the creative strategy, how the creative strategy ties back to the market research. Could you walk us through an example of a campaign, maybe in your current job, since it's probably fresher, of where you had a market insight, you created a creative strategy, and you created an execution based on that research and that creative strategy?
People respond a lot more to word of mouth. And that's just so wild because, we live in a day and age where we're just constantly being influenced. But what we found with UT San Antonio in particular, I think, is that like people are responding to this campaign of people, real people in a variety of different types of walks of life, especially with some sort of connection to San Antonio and connection to UT San Antonio, whether they'd be stop outs, people who've stopped out of school and returning, wanting to return. We're building content for folks from all over the world to be a part of the UT San Antonio brand online. But what we're finding is that a lot of our graduates and a lot of the folks who are responding to our content, are have some sort of affiliate to San Antonio or to UT San Antonio. And so I think that itself is a kind of word of mouth, or a kind of just a brand continuity, and it shows that it's strong, that the brand is strong, that UT San Antonio is growing.
That's awesome to hear. Obviously, I'm biased, right? I'm part of UT San Antonio's system, and I want it to be successful. I imagine that the reinforcement of the digital messages are helping to drive the actual word of mouth conversation. Can you kind of pull back the curtain onto how you're crafting messages to spark real conversation and word of mouth advertising? Because word of mouth advertising has been around for a long time. The digital stuff, maybe not as long, but it's been around. And combining both of those into one kind of campaign that is trying to trigger the call to action of talk about how great your experience was at UT San Antonio, or talking to others about how you're considering a choice to improve your life by attending UT San Antonio.
I think what you're speaking to really comes down to messaging. And we have an opportunity as we're building creative content to think about the words. And I think because we live in a day and age where information is so powerful and is so influential, the words we use and how we use them really can make an impact and really can drive an influence. So it also really allows me to think about like what choices we made when I was at Texas Public Radio and we were during pledge drive campaigns. So it's very similar. I mean, it's like this thing that people believe in, people support. And so the words that you use, you kind of want to use them in a way that build a sort of affinity and that will, kind of like be authentic to what's happening in real time. And I think that is a lesson that we learned in how we're building adverts or just, original content for UT San Antonio's online program, because it's very similar, as you mentioned, it is kind of a word of mouth and people see the real impact. And so I think that itself is the story.
What are some other things you've learned from maybe outside consultants or supervisors or people who are really in the front lines of the marketing and the strategy? What are some key takeaways you've taken from them in your journeys of creating ads for these clients?
It really is that funnel mindset, Ryan. I mean, that Pointer Institute program, Texas Public Radio was thinking about the future and thinking about how to create a sustainable way to reach audiences and to grow audiences. And I think everything that went down to how we produced advertisements was to bring somebody from that top of funnel downward. So thinking about what that process is like for whatever it is you're trying to reach people for will be an effective way to reach people. And then when you get people at that final, like as I mentioned, that final part of the funnel, that the deepest part, and understanding why they've stayed or why they stuck around or why they're loyal members or why they're loyal to the brand, getting to understand that insight and how they're connected is so important, and that you learn so much from that moment.
Yeah. And this idea of action at the bottom of the funnel, I'm sure there's some secret sauce there too. What are some of the strategies that have been used in your experience to help nudge or convince people who have taken those other steps to take that final step that you want them to take? And I know that often in this context, it's not something as simple as donate a few bucks to NPR or TPR, or, donate a few bucks to UT San Antonio. A lot of times it's a much bigger step. It's that step of actually joining and becoming a sustaining member, or joining, actually going to University of Texas at San Antonio to improve your quality of life. But these are big decisions that are not taken lightly. And even if you're at the bottom of the funnel, often there are messages that influence the way you think about how to take that next step. I know one of them is identity. I want to be the kind of person who supports TPR or UT San Antonio. What do you see that you can influence there to help nudge people to that, over that finish line?
There's a lot to that, but I will say that taking moments to capture insight, from those moments and capture data, whether it's anecdotal or whether it is, through a survey about why and how those people see themselves, especially if it's affiliated with your brand or your product, you learn from that and you continue to build off that. So that's just what I would say in kind of continuation to that particular question. But another piece of information as it relates to Texas Public Radio, and what I learned, whenever you're learning from them and you're showing audiences that you are learning, you're being very authentic and very transparent with that data. That is also a way to make people a bit more loyal and make people a bit more connected with what you're doing, because it shows that their word or their information made a difference. And to the same respect at UT San Antonio, people are right now, what we're doing is we're telling their story and we're showing them that their story is resonating with other folks. And that's a cool way to just keep people on board, get people on board with the messaging and how you tell that message.
That sounds super fun, being able to see the impact that my video created, or that, my messaging created, in how it might outlive the conversation that I might have had with the UT San Antonio team. Can you walk us through some of those impacts that you have seen and how effective those have been in helping move people towards UT San Antonio?
I mean, I'm also fairly new to the team here at UT San Antonio. I feel like I've been here for almost 2 years in this, or rather almost 3 years in the second stint. But in this last particular piece of content that we created, that I learned from a recent graduate, and that was one of your students. She talked about just how much the brand and really the culture at UT San Antonio was so important to her. And this is a student who was living in Maryland, so like living in a completely different state. But the fact that she once came here and was once, is from San Antonio and wanted to finish her degree because the culture is so important to her, I think that's something that we are definitely being mindful of in how we're producing content in the future, is how we're like bottling that culture and making sure that that's authentic, and to making sure that story is also being told as well.
So identity, culture, authenticity. What are some other things that come to the forefront whenever you're actually designing these messages to resonate?
When you are marketing content and you are in charge of ads, if you have a moment to build more than one type of ad that has a different type of feel than what was originally created, that moment of being able to learn how that is being received or consumed, that A/B testing, you also really learn from. So that's something I would say that should drive a design process, or should drive how you do how you're creating ads.
And have you learned anything unique or interesting from your A/B test and your creative? They're like, this one worked and this one didn't. And you're like, why? Why didn't this work? What is it that's resonating about this piece?
So when you're creating ads, you're going to find that, certain ads will do better because of just the general format, just how they're sometimes laid out on a website, sometimes how they're laid out on an application, and how sometimes they're served to you in an algorithm. And that should never, you should never be personally offended by what is being, a bit more received. But what I would say is that you learn from how and why. Something that I learned is that everything is changing, right? Everything is affecting the algorithm. The algorithm's learning how people are reacting to content. But what I learned when I was really in charge of seeing all of that data is that, during pledge drives, you want to have as much out on an advertisement so that people can see what's happening. What you find really is that the advertisements with, I think it's like the rule is like 25% of the actual piece is words and everything else is visual. That is more received, and that sometimes gets served more because people are looking for more visual things and not really trying to read tiny text on an ad. So again, how the ad is oriented, the size of the ad, all impacts how you're able to tell the message, but you want to do it effectively to that respective size.
I'm so glad you mentioned the importance of visual language and visual storytelling, because just like we're trying to match creative strategy that's based on good market research, we want to make sure that we move people with the images, words, and sound that is being presented. What are some other key takeaways you have from working on advertisements specifically that try to get people to take that next step?
Let's see. So we talked about the funnel, we talked about messaging, we talked about the visual sort of parameters and sometimes limitations and how to achieve that. I would say something and we talked about the audience, which is again very important. And I can't drive that enough. Is like if you ever have time to learn from your audience, you're only going to make your advertisements more effective because you learn how to tell different types of stories in different types of ways. Another thing that we could maybe go over that I learned because it was so niche was that like be original with what has already been done. So in the terms of a pledge drive, everybody has already heard that pledge drives fund how a nonprofit radio station is operating, right? It's like the lifeblood. You are able to allow them to produce content because you support them every year. But people get tired of hearing that message and people tune out. And so that's one thing that we learned. Whenever we had these really cool interns or folks who were new to the station who just wanted to try a different type of way of messaging, that was always most effective. And that sometimes made the pledge drive end quicker because people were responding to something that was out of the ordinary or swam against the current. So that's why I mentioned like earlier in this conversation that whenever you have an opportunity to get inspired by something outside of what you're designing, use that inspiration and kind of like deconstruct it and understand why, because you can learn from that moment and you can sometimes make your advertisement more effective.
I love that. I want specific examples if we can. Great advertising, they say, this is an old quote from when I was taking advertising classes, is about making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And I can't think of anything more familiar than a pledge drive or an ask for a donation to your university. These are kinds of messages we get all the time. So how are you making those strange specifically? How are you making those memorable?
It was a moment where people were thinking outside of the box, and it was during the pandemic. And we were really trying to grab people who were listening to the radio live in a different way. So we were utilizing like clips that were from mainstream media, like from movies and from like The Simpsons and Sopranos, like that. There were one-liners that like if you're listening to the radio and you're listening for a particular news reporter and you hear something that is related to the pledge drive, but then you hear Homer Simpson or you hear Tony Soprano, it just shocks you for a second, and then people start to listen a little bit more. And so again, it was like during live radio, and so we were able to be a bit more playful with it. But those moments, like specifically, I think were fun kind of anecdotes that like showed people who were really listening responded.
I remember the words driveway moments being used in one pledge campaign. And I know it's a common thing on TPR and NPR, but I remember Ira Glass making a personal appeal just to me through my radio saying, you've had those driveway moments. You know what we do is important. Now, if you could just bring yourself to help support your local radio station, it makes all this magic possible. And the way that he leaned into the mic and was talking just to that one person. Do you have other examples like that of effective messaging that really moved the needle for donators?
We were, again, messaging at a time when people were getting all different types of messaging at all different types of times, but being able to just show in real time and gather some like real types of visuals of this at this moment. I really hate going back to thinking about the pandemic, but just getting visuals of restaurants closed and letting people know that like we're providing real time information, at a moment when you really rely on it and you're relying on us and we're relying on you. And so thinking about those words again, and then in a moment where people were sensitive to how information was being shared. So like, as you mentioned, like sometimes the intonation of our voices and really that kind of sensory experience where you really want to sound like you're coming from a place of authenticity and really a place where people can trust you. That was, something we were very sensitive to, is like, how can that resonate, content that resonates with people in that particular way?
There's this great quote, again, Ira Glass, because we're on that topic. He says, "Great stories happen to people who can tell them." And I always love quoting him for that, because he has one of this incredibly successful storytelling program that people tune into because it's so effective at telling these stories and these unique points of view. What are some examples of effective ads that you've seen? Maybe not at UT San Antonio or at TPR, but what are some of the ones that you've really liked and you were like, wow, that really moves me? I really like that.
I alluded to one earlier. Like I said, I'm a runner, and I do like to see running ads because I'm a creative myself, and those two things kind of intersect there for me. So I guess, yeah, if I'm shouting out the brand, it's Tracksmith, and it's because like there's this one ad that I saw that didn't have a lot of copy on it, and it didn't have any sort of like a narrative other than like this person was going out for a run. And it's something that we learned later on that's what they did every day. And it's because how it was cut, and it's because you see the same thing, but different outfits and in different ways. That was an effective ad, and it didn't say much at the end other than the logo, and that kind of stuff just is a sensory experience. And again, it shows and doesn't tell.
And the story there is persistence. The story there is grit. The story is, doing it even whenever it's really, really difficult to get out of bed and start running.
And that they're wearing Tracksmith the whole time, so they're loyal to the brand, and no matter which run.
I saw a running ad recently. I thought of you because I know you're into running. It was a Brooks shoe ad. And it was so interesting because they were featuring local running clubs and highlighting these clubs all over the place as, part of the message of community. The running community was their main messaging there. Again, it was well shot. It had the hero product happening, but it also had the community happening and the connections with other human beings that were a result of the running clubs.
And I'm sure they had some really cool either like action shots of the shoes in action. I'm sure that kind of sensory experience kept you watching. So running ads particularly have an opportunity to bring you into that feeling. And I think that's what also makes them effective.
The research and strategy that goes into these ads, as a runner, you have a little bit better insight because you are familiar with the running products in ways that maybe non-runners wouldn't be. So whenever you see an ad for either of these brands, I'm sure it's hitting you in a different way because you're at the purchase point, right? You're considering buying that running shoe. Can you pull back the curtain of the mind of a runner whenever he's consuming these ads and how that might differ from someone who isn't?
I mean, I think that in the same kind of way I mentioned about public radio listeners, they hear the same message all the time. And I think runners see the same kind of message all the time. This is the new and best foam for your shoe, or et cetera. Anytime that message can be told in a different way, or the brands can differ in that particular type of messaging, it's a bit more resonant.
I'm thinking of examples like Nike, of course, because Michael Jordan, that made the brand. The movie, I think, is called Air. Such a great movie, and it gives insights into the marketing process and principles that serve us even in this digital world that we live in, that worked back then, that work today. I know celebrity endorsements are controversial sometimes because how much of that actually translates to the brand. I know that these athletes are paid for their name recognition, right? What have you seen that's been effective in marketing shoes specifically?
What I found most effective is a brand that I also really like, and it's an opportunity where folks have realized that like people are coming back into running or coming to running for the first time, and anytime you can reach other people in a variety of different types of groups, and so where you can merge music and running and art all in one type of way, and you can reach different types of communities. It's an intersection. And I think that's what I found most interesting, that with ads and with this one particular brand that I'm referencing, is that like they've realized that like that is an effective way to tell stories. That's an effective way to reach people, is to just fuse it all together and make it cool and make it original.
What brand was that?
The brand is it's called Satisfy. It's out of Paris, and I think this is one brand to watch because they've been copied by brands like Nike specifically, and is a pretty interesting phenomenon. I think a lot of people are in the running world we're kind of attuned to that particular type of bite, if you will, that Nike did. But yeah, I mean they're very authentic in how they're telling their story, because they're reaching people again who are maybe coming to running for the first time, maybe played in bands for a while and were maybe just joining running for the first time and find it interesting. So if you can merge the two, music and running, together, you're going to find that that's an interesting way to tell that story.
Is that cultural connection, the music and the image, creating a cultural connection that speaks to people's identity, to people's authentic experience of maybe coming back to running, like you said, or coming to it for the first time. What are some other key lessons that you've seen in the marketplace for this passion of yours, running?
Just because I'm following it pretty frequently, because I'm also a consumer, I've got an interesting perspective in that way. Somebody who's creating ads, somebody who's like deconstructing these ads as I'm watching them, somebody who's considering the price points of some of these things, and somebody who's considering a lot of different types of that in that respect. I'm really considering like, what is my personal stake, or what is my personal entry point in this industry, and like what really resonates to me. And whenever I see an ad, or whenever I really get drawn to how a story's told, I think that stuff is effective. And I think that that's what people are just a bit more mindful of now, is like storytelling is not just in an advertisement, but storytelling is also in product design and product creation, and so and conception and ideation, everything from how it's given to the audience, and that is just another feedback loop. So that's just something that I would continue to just remember, that like your input as a consumer, your input as a creator, your input as just somebody who is interested is effective.
And the benefits of the product too, right? Because I'm looking for a shoe that'll last a little bit longer, but I know runners go through shoes probably far faster. So that brand is speaking to a specific product benefit that they're trying to sell. You mentioned before, like new foam, or fresh foam, or
Yeah.
maybe they have some special air bubbles in their foam. All these little things, these little tweaks that they're making to the product are part of that messaging, aren't they?
Certainly. I mean, you're speaking to an important thing. I mean, we spend a lot of money on shoes. And so there's one particular brand who is a Canadian brand called Norda. Their shoes are like $300 or more, but they pride themselves in saying that this shoe is going to last you 3+ years. You're not going to have to buy a bunch of different shoes, because this is the one that it's an investment. You start thinking about the investment you're making in your health. You think about the investment you're making in your time. You really just consider, like, if they are building a product that say it's going to, outlast others, how does that resonate with you as a consumer? How does that resonate with you as somebody who's a participant in whatever it is that they're producing?
So that's the top of the marketplace in terms of cost, I would imagine. Can you fill in some of the other parts of the marketplace that deal with the other consumers who maybe aren't as interested in it lasting 3 whole years?
I think what I think is that and what I can see from just following these products is that people are actually, again, responding to that top tier level, like Nike was responding to Satisfy and creating a very similar product. Brands like Brooks, brands like or Saucony or whatever, are also trying to find ways to make more sustainable products like this top tier brand is, because they're focusing on higher quality product, more effective product for your runner. When consumers see that other brands are focusing on that, I think that's a trend for the industry. Much like there was a focus on the minimal shoe, then there was a focus on the stack shoe, and now it's coming back down to a more grounding level. So it ebbs and flows, but I think right now the focus on sustainability is important, and not just the running industry, but all around. And I think that's something that you're seeing as a phenomenon is affecting advertisements and product and et cetera.
Yeah. What are some other intersections? I know sustainability is an intersection where other brands are doing this just like shoe brands are. What are some other intersectional values like sustainability that you see in the running industry specifically?
Yeah, so we mentioned culture, we mentioned sustainability. I think authenticity is also very important. And this is just kind of goes back to everything, and maybe kind of can kind of bring us to a culmination rather of all these ideas, is that like the only way that you can really be effective as a storyteller through advertisements is to be authentic to that particular story. If you are telling your own story, if you're helping somebody tell their story, be authentic in how that is done. It's a cliche, but if you can do that in your own particular way, and you can study from other people and be inspired by other types of things, you see that that's what these other brands are doing right now. And the integration of culture, the focus on sustainability, those are, again, like you mentioned, not respective to running, but they're all over our society right now, and they really encompass everything that we're thinking about. And so when we see that brands are responding to that too, we tend to kind of build a bit more trust, or we tend to kind of build a bit more resonance with what they're doing. So again, it's just being a human and being really conscious of what's happening in real time, and knowing that people are going to have different types of changes, and being able to pivot and respond to that in real time and learn from those moments will make you an effective advertiser.
I love that. What is one final thought you'd like to leave with our audience as we wrap up here?
Other than the authenticity, I think that finding ways to be inspired and not compare yourself or not compare what you're doing to other people is one thing that I'm constantly always trying to do. And I think as a creator, we struggle with that. But if you can just find ways to truly understand like what is authentic to you and what is authentic to this thing you're trying to do, and doing that in a fun and cool way, and remember that you're having fun as a creator to do it, that will also be effective.
We're serving that audience, we're serving that target audience, and that their life will be better with this particular shoe or with this particular organization. It's not only a part of their identity, but it's something that will hopefully elevate their living experience literally. Rob, where can people find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn. And the last thing I will just say as a kind of reiterating what you mentioned, yes, think about your audience. Think about how the audience is going to receive what you're doing, and you can be effective that way as well.
Awesome. We'll be sure to have that link in the description. Rob, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate you.
Thanks for your time.